at pronouncing names. So, yay, me. I'll start here in 1 more minute. We'll start here. Yuri Kochiyami. Kachiyami. Yuri Kachiyami. Oh, I might have got that one right. All right, let's go ahead and start. People that are going to be here are going to be here. People are not going to be here, not going to be here. I love that song too. All right, here we go. We have to stem the tide of polarization. We must close the gap, bringing down the barriers and make bridges instead of walls. Yuri Kachiyami. Miss Magazine's 1993 profile of Yuri Kachiyami presents a model for ethnic inter-ethnic alliances and coalition building. Having survived a U.S. internment camp during World War II, Kachiyami moved to Harlem in 1963, where she organized as a civil rights activist. Kachiyami, who states that she was politicized by Malcolm X and other black radicals, engages in grassroots activism and coalition building in New York City, organizing within the Japanese American Redress Movement and amnesty campaigns for political prisoners. Her work builds bridges between some of the most polarized ethnic populations in the United States, Africans and Asian Americans. Portrayed as deviant and model minorities respectively, Africans and Asian Americans are the U.S. cultural caricature of intellectual under and overarchers. In a society that depicts the African as the embodiment of the worst traits of non-whites and the Asian as the ideal non-white, the model minority per excellence is the Japanese America. Yet the title is deceptive. During the 20th century, the U.S. government alternately incarcerated Japanese Americans in concentration camps and held them as white people. According to Karl Marx, Japanese American citizens were conferred the status of honorary white people during the gentleman's agreement period between the two world wars. Under apartheid, and South African government also granted this distinction to Japanese. As honorary whites, Japanese Americans are exempt from severe residential segregation and unemployment discrimination. This mythology of the model minority at once dehumanizes those not part of this group and obscures struggles against poverty and culture and language discrimination in non-monolithically constructed Asian American communities. In a June 1990 New York Times letter, Ronald Takayaki observed, quote, "Most Asian Americans know their success is largely a myth. They also see how the celebration of Asian American as the quote-unquote model minority perpetuates their inequality and exacerbates relations between them and African Americans. Asking for whom Asians are to be models, Takayaki notes that, quote, such comparisons pits minorities against each other, while the victims are blamed for their plight, rather than racism and the economy that has made many young African workers superfluous. Non-whites are definitely valued, yet share diverse standings as superfluous, marginalized interlopers in the racialized society and culture. Jessica Hedgedorn describes how American cinema stereotypes of Asian women are analogous to the American Africanism critique by Toni Morrison. And I think this is what he says. All right, hold on a second. Make sure, all right, that looks good. Asian women are ultimately wet dreams in most Hollywood movies. Ew. We exist to provide sex, color, and texture, and that is essentially a white man's world. As this is akin to what Toni Morrison calls, quote, Africanist presence, end quote, in literature. She writes, quote, just as entertainers, through or by association with blackface, could render permissible topics that otherwise would have been taboos. So American writers were able to employ an imagined Africanist persona to articulate the imaginatively. I gotta look up the word because I cannot say the dang word. My tongue won't let me say it. Hold up. Imaginatively. Can't say it because it's imaginatively. Act out the forbidden in American culture. The same analogy could be made for the often titillating presence of Asian women in movies made by white men. The Asianist presence, like the Africanist presence, gets a civilized whiteness against the backdrop of a racially sexualized other. Alliance building entails more than white and color polarities. Anti-Asian sentiments in black communities focus on economic competition, which oft expressed in boycotts of Asian groceries and businesses in black neighborhoods, as well as in general attitudes of ethnic chauvinism and xenophobia. Anti-African and black sentiment in Asian communities are less tied to economics than to a mythologized portrait of black people as embodiment of violent criminality, which in turn leads to a sentiment of Asian radical racial superiority to black people. African Americans' perception of an anti-black racism among Asians fuels the divide between two populations. For instance, black media sources for the last decade have reported an African American bashing in Japan, where white supremacist depictions of African Americans have been adapted for the Japanese culture. The original can't say that. Sorry, my bad. Toothpaste, more melanated skin. Toothpaste, now called, oh my gosh, Dairy? I don't know how to say it, is marketed in Asia by Colgate Palmolive with the caricature of a black minstrel figure. Other sources have exposed anti-African American racism in Japanese businesses. For instance, in the tourist industry, where the Japanese magazine reportedly issued a map of Harlem illustrated by the Mammy figure. Ooh. A figure in 1990, Newsweek issue published a survey of Japanese citizens in which 57% stated that too many racial and ethnic groups reside in the United States. Degenerating caste systems and the aversion to black physical characteristics are not uncommon in both African and Asian American communities. Given that antipathy for blackness is held multi-ethnically. Conversely, shared politically identity among people confronting racism encourage solidarity, coalition politics, and the formation of new languages of race in the instance of subaltern states. subaltern states. For instance, people of color, women of color, and black denoting people stigmatized by white supremacy. The later term was used by progressive in apartheid South Africa, are terms that exemplify these new anti-racist racial groups. Yet, renaming one's individual self or group does not in itself address how national structures and indoctrinate people into a race thinking and economic competition that are shaped by psychological insecurities and social ambitions. Solidarity is likely sustainable only where one confronts institutions that promote schisms between ethnic groups and where one can challenge the perception that the dominant state is both unvulnerable and the only viable vehicle for safety and success. This is what the United States does. This is what the white supremacist structures do. Pin other non-white ethnic groups against each other. It's been doing, and they also do it within the colonized world too. You know, the global South. Obviously, there are neither monolithic Asians and African American communities, nor a monolithic class of women in general. Alongside color and caste divisions, class is also problematic in the forming of effective decolonizing alliances. Both the perceived and the real economic and educational differences between the two groups complicate the union of progressive political groups. At times, Asian and African Americans may be able to unite along class and color lines in the United States. The same lines can allow them as people of color elites to distance themselves from poor people and political issues of those of the periphery of society. Periphery meaning like the global South and what we're doing to do imperialism and stuff. Given the international division of labor and classism, sharing the same skin tone or status as non-whites does not necessarily align African and Asian Americans with exploited developing world peoples. Many struggles with and are shaped by the contradictions of ambiguities of a double consciousness and the multiple allegiances felt amid increasing class and color stratification among elite and neo-colonized groups of people. Despite the multiplicities of alliances and the border crossing in different directions, one can explore without romanticizing the possibilities for strengthening political and inter-ethnic coalitions and decolonization efforts. The romantic notion held in the 1930s during World War II among African Americans that a victorious Japan, as a leader of the people of color race, they said the other way, would liberate black Americans, is argued half a century later by some African Americans academics who surmise that the post-war economic power of Japan signals the demise of white European supremacy. What such an arguments fail to consider, however, is that the militarism, economic and racial hierarchies, sexism, ethnic chauvinism are characteristics shared by both Japan and the United States, irrespective of military and trade battles. The U.S. and Japanese government have formed their own strategic alliances. One way to expand the connection between progressive Asia and African American is to examine these state alliances to see how much unions regulate women and other disenfranchised groups in each state's household. State alliances. Next section. American forces occupied Japan from 1945 to 1948, ousting right-wing militarists from the Japanese government, only to restore them in 1949 in the wake of China's Communist Revolution and the Soviet Union's acquisition of the atomic bomb. Like the Yahtzee's counterparts, Unit 731 of the Japanese Imperial Army conducted biological warfare and, among others, medical experiments, dissecting Chinese prisoners of war without using anesthetic. An estimate of 20 million Chinese died in the 1930s and 1940s from Japanese militarism and the war atrocities, treating the Japanese much as it had Yahtzee scientists. The U.S. government covered up Japanese use of biological warfare in exchange for research gathering by Japanese scientists. The United States freed accused war criminals like Nubasuk Kashiya, who later became Japanese Prime Minister. Some rehabilitated politicians reputedly worked with organized crime groups or the Yakuza. Yoshi Kodama, for example, was, quote, a political fixer and later a major CIA contact in Japan who worked behind the scenes to finance the conservatives. According to the 1994 New York Times report, government documents disclosed in 1990s revealed that in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. channeled millions of dollars through the CIA to the Liberal Democratic Party to gather information, oppose communism in Asia, and undermine the Japanese left. Today, despite trade wars and escalating conflicts sparked by the 1995 $66 billion trade deficit with Japan, corporations between the two states remain intact. As economic and military power, the United States and Japan have shaped sites of racial, sexual, and economic exploitation within their respective households and territorial spheres of influence through their domestic and foreign policies. Historically, each state has used methodologies of racial purity and superiority of rationalized foreign intervention. Both states have maintained domestic households or internal colonies of ethnically, sexually, and economically oppressed peoples, largely sustained by women who labor in the family, as well as formal and underground economies. The similarities of Japanese and African American women have, aside from not being white, most likely stem from the shared contradictions of living, for some, in considerable comfort in imperial states. Historically, expansionist nations, the United States and Japan, have two of the highest standards of living in the world. During the 1980s, U.S. life expectancy increased from 75.3 to 75.4 years. For European Americans, life expectancy was 78.3 and 73.1 years, respectively, for women and men in Japan. Japan's 120 million people have a similar birth rate, 1.9%, to that of the United States, 1.8%. The maternal mortality rate are low as well. The living condition of ethnic minorities in the United States and Japan are shaped by a color caste system. For some women and their families, in Japan, the states, like its U.S. counterpart, differentiate services and equality. In Japan's internal colonies, for instance, minority women live unequal lives, much as American women of color. The Berkuninum Koreans, the Okinawans, the Philippines, and the Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan, who collectively form a small percentage of the Japanese population, experience racism similar to that faced by African Americans, segregated and inferior housing, hiring discriminations, and job segregation, disproportionately high unemployment and restriction from unions, poor health, poor performance in standardized educational testing, with the bias towards the dominant culture, the less access to university education, underreporting in the government census minimizes state allocations of resources to marginalized ethnic groups. According to the New York Times article, the Burakumin, it's a Burakumin, quote, were Japan's official outcast for more than a century, giving jobs that were considered unclean, like butchering and leatherwork. Although this treatment officially ended in the 19th century, they remain the targets of discrimination and live isolated in closed communities. The lives of repressed ethnic minorities in Japan mirror those of their American counterparts who encounter discrimination, racial slurs, violence, and general denial, and the deviation wrought by racial and imperial policies. As in the United States, however, oppressed Japanese citizens organize against such racism. For example, Korean-born Japanese challenged laws that require them to register with the state as foreigners, to be fingerprinted, and to carry identification cards, with the exceptions of the Konketsuji, which is Konketsuji. The African Japanese community, also minorities, could pass through assimilation. Some, however, chose to organize for economic, culture, and identity rights, and have done so in coalition with people of African descent. There is an extensive history of African and Asian activism against some forms of racism and imperialism. For example, the Bandung Conference in Africa/Asian nations in Indonesia in April 1955, and other African Asian solidarity conferences of non-aligned nation in Egypt, Ghana, Sri Lanka, Guinea, Algeria, and Cuba. More recently, in 1982, Burakumin Japanese and African Americans worked together at an international conference to combat racism in Japan, organized by educator activists, the Koho Daomi, and the Baraku Liberation League. I'm saying these names horribly. Then and now, Burakumin and African Americans have shared strategies for fighting racism through circular reform, non-racist and non-sexist school books, and the writings and publishing of histories and stories about Burakumin culture and people. Today, Burakumin organizing continues through the international movement against all forms of discrimination and racism. Also, the Japan Pacific Resource Network, JPRN, works with African Americans and labor organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of People of Color, but they flipped it, the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Unions, and the Japanese African American Association. The JPRN worked with the Coalition of Asian Women's Rights to produce, quote, Migrant Women in Japan, Discrimination and the Struggles for Equal Rights, end quote. The Labor Video Project Educational Forum on the Sexual and Economic Exploitation of Filipinas. It's Filipinas in Japan. These organizing and educational campaigns face states that increasingly form their own alliance and hegemony and domination. Next section. Japanese and U.S. polities? Managing race in state alliances. Polities. protectionism and economic nationalism that view developing world imports and workers as competition are misguided because of the international nature of production and the global scale of multinationals. Anita Fatiz and Barbara, Ehrenreich, Women in the Global Factory. Combined, the United States and Japan formed the world's largest economies, with 1/3 of the world's total gross national product. With Germany, they share the highest World Bank rankings, along with Western Europe, North America, and Japan constituting 15% of the world's population, consume more than 70% of the world's resources, while controlling the world capitalist markets. Yet this is an uneasy partnership. According to an April 1990 report in the New York Times, in the 1980s, as the world's largest debtor nation faced with declining exports, the United States had a purchasing power triple that of Japan. Its gross national product was $5.2 billion to Japan's $1.9 billion. An average trade balance from 1981 to 1987 of $97 billion for the United States to Japan's $52 billion. However, provoked incidents of Japan's bashing. Economic nationalists decried Japanese penetration of U.S. markets and cited the U.S. trade deficit with Japan, $49 billion in 1989, half to Americans' $100 billion trade deficit. In contrast, Japan had a $400 billion trade surplus with the United States in the 1980s. Japanese corporations have invested billions of dollars in European community, with Eastern Europe cities serving as a new, Manquelandio Rus, or low-wage industrial sectors in free enterprise zones for manufacturing and marketing cars and electronics up to Western European cities. Japan bashing or anti-Japanese racism has become virulent in United States and Europe. Seemingly, the rise of a dominant non-European economic power poses a threat to U.S. economic interests, although heavy German and Swedish investments in the United States have not led to any identifiable occurrences of German and Swede bashing. Fueled by economic interest, anti-Japanese nationalism has continued to spread throughout corporations, Congress, media, and market firms. The kiddie pop culture. Street violence informed by anti-Japanese sentiments has also risen. In 1983, Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American man mistaken for a Japanese, was beaten to death with baseball bats by two unemployed white auto workers who blamed the car industry slump on the importation of Japanese cars. Although both men were convicted of murder, they received suspended sentences with community work as part of the rehabilitation and parole. Sony Corporation Chairman Akio Morita's the Japan that can say, quote, no, the United States-Japan relations card, and Japanese statesman Shintaro Asahira's, I can't say it. The United States that can say, quote, no, why Japan will be first among equals, countered anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States. The latter book, which was printed in the Congressional Records, argues that Japan was the okay, I don't know this word. I have to look up this word. We're right back, everybody. not that one. We gotta go to effects. Obsequious. As soon as it changes over. So that's what it means. Obedient and attentive to an excessive or severe degree. Is my internet going okay? Everything working good on the internet part? Or am I like acquiescence of relationships to the United States and that white European supremacy prevents America from accepting Japan as an equal partner in economic and political affairs? Sweet, thank you. While certain corporate and government sectors market racist nationalism as good business, others, particularly multinational corporations and banks, view anti-Japanese racism and Japanese anti-American response as potentially harmful to profit. Seeking to maintain their economic hegemony and to manage anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in the United States, corporate interests and policy analysis often try to prevent the potential disruption of capitalist economic growth with conflict mediation. Their proposal advocate healing the schisms between the two dominant nations, with the reminder that this is, after all, a family fight. Conflict mediation proposals by Japanese analysts also support the state alliance between Japan and the United States, criticizing U.S. racism for contributing to the rise of American bashing in Japan. They argue for the creation of United States-Japan bilateral organization, including on the Economic Council and a trade court of depoliticized and depublicized trade disputes and joint manufacturing facilities in the United States. Other policy experts have improved on the two heads are better than one approach, with a proposal of aiding a third, the European community headed by Western European elites. Such a triumvirate. I don't know this word. You need to look up this word. I tried. Triumvirate. Weird. And that means it's a big one. Come on. Thank you. In ancient Rome, a group of three men holding power, in particular, the first triumvirate, the unofficial coalition of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crocus in 60 BC. Okay, so it's just, okay. All right, oops, where are we going? Going here, and we're going all the way to here. All right, back to it. Would then coordinate international economic policies concerning space exploration, sea mining, energy, refugees, drug trafficking, population, and global environment, and international human rights. Despite competitive economic wars and their consistent calls for greater joint American-Japanese military operations in the Asian-Pacific region, where the United States and Japan control 70% of the economic activity, of Americans' estimated annual sale of more than $10 billion, Japan is a primary client, purchasing an estimate of $570 million to $1 billion in weapons in the early 1990s. Although defeated in World War II, Japan had the world's fourth largest military at the time of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Historically, Japanese imperialism directed against South Asian countries under the banner of Asia for the Asiatics, coined by the imperial wars of U.S. Manifest Destiny in the Americas. Currently, both states use military and police forces to control workers and destabilize self-determination's activities. National economies and social orders are also integrated into the military as public monies are diverted for social programs to war efforts. Japanese feminists argue in Feminine Turns, a Japanese feminist quarterly, that the Japanese economic miracle was, quote, sparked by Japanese serving of the U.S. military in the Korean War, and that Japanese investment and exploitation in Korea was facilitated by the U.S. military presence in both countries. Simultaneously, competitive and corporative U.S. and Japanese policies create colonial sites that profit from the degradation of women's labor, bodies, and families. Although popularly portrayed as antagonistic competitors, American and Japanese government and corporate leaders manage racist nationalism to control economic change and to retain a significant degree of power over resources and labor. Working in the state's household, neo-colonies, and post-colonial world. Here we go. Whereas the traditional forms of chattel slavery may have disappeared, the most widespread form tend now to be debt bondage, exploitation, and of the prostitution of others, exploitation of child labor, and the sale of prostitution of children. Other forms include the slavery-like exploitation of domestic help, forced labor, and surveil forms of marriage. Manifestations of an apartheid and colonialism have also been classified as practices similar to slavery. 9 Lesian United Nations efforts to eradicate slavery and slave-like practices. Nina Lesian's observation about contemporary labor exploitation are echoed by Mary I. Buckley. Encounter with Asian Poverty and Women's Invisible Work, end quote, in which she argues that the work of masses of women, quote, is all but invisible, which means that they are owned, possessed, appropriated like natural resources, the bottom line for keeping them in submission to ultimately violence. Jesus, that's fucking on point. God damn. Let me read that again. In which she argues that the work of the masses of the people, quote, is all but invisible, which means that they are owned, possessed, appropriated like natural resources. The bottom line for keeping them in submission is ultimately violence. In the late 1980s, UNICEF reported that since the 1960s, developing world countries have fallen deeper into debt and poverty. International monetary funds and World Bank policies have maintained underdevelopment in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, where individuals annually transfer more than $20 billion to North America and Western European banks. This outside investment in the face of increasing illiteracy, malnutrition, disease, and death in their own communities. As a region, Asia is exempt from increasing impoverishment, yet most Asian women and children workers do not share this exemption. Like other developing world, women and youth, they labor at merely subsistent wages in international production, more than 100 free trade or export processing zones, largely controlled by the United States, Japan, or European community. Multinational corporations target women as docile workers for light assembly work. 80 to 90% of the workers in these zones are women, the majority of whom are 16 to 25 years of age, citing the South Korean textiles and Malaysian electronics markets are examples of industry developed with assistance from the U.S. Agency of International Development. Antoinette Fontines and Barbara Erich maintain that the, quote, most powerful promoters of exploitative conditions for developing world women workers is the U.S. government, end quote. In the International Division of Labor, most, quote, black women are segregated in low-paying, dangerous jobs. Here, the state oversees racial and sexual colonies that expropriate so-called women's work in biological reproduction and socialization, waged house, field, and factory labor, and the sex industry. Work is often synonymous with exploitation through inequitable wages, domestic or work abuse, physical dangers in sweatshops, prison industries, and prostitution. Reproductive labor is an unpaid domestic work performed by women are mainstays of modern economic and political systems. As free labor, reproduction creates the family and workforce. Exploitation is the norm in household labor. Repressive wage domestic work is disproportionately borne by women of color who are meagerly paid to reproduce and manage elite families and households. In the 1980s, for example, more African American women are employed as domestics than as professional, according to Karl Marx. The similarities and conditions of African Americans and Japanese American women workers are explored in Evelyn's Nakano Glenn's work on Japanese American women domestics. According to Glenn, despite significant differences in experiences in the United States, the similarities between the two groups are noteworthy. Japanese Americans have also faced institutional racism and segregation into low-paying domestic or agricultural jobs, even when they are college educated. Glenn states that ISSEI domestic workers, West Coast first-generation Japanese migrant women, divided work into three categories: housing, housework, unpaid work in the family, farm or businesses, and paid work, usually domestic in nature set by feudal relations. Even though subjugated by institutional racism, domestic work, and the structures of Assi's family life, ISSIEI. I wonder what that means, family life. Let me find out what that means, if it even lets me. Right back. We're gonna find out what that means. Issei, it's the Japanese immigrants from North America. Issei family life. These women were not victims, according to Glenn. Quote, the Issei maximized autonomy in employment by choosing work situations in which employers were absent or inactive. In the family, they went out to work secretly or withheld part of their wages as a means to gain control over disposable income, end quote. Japanese and African American women struggle with the patriarchal restrictions of the state in family households, just as in Japan, where Barukamin and Korean women are most often relegated to domestic work for employment. Among African Among Africa descended legal workers in the United States, high infant and maternal mortality rates and falling life expectancy rates reflect the devastation of colonized life. The double shift of unpaid domestic work and wage labor has turned into a triple shift for a growing number of working class women. With increased shifts come multiple exposures to overwork, ill health, and physical and psychological exhaustion. The number of women holding 2 or more jobs quintupled in 1970 to 1990 from 636,000 to 3.1 million. While, oh my gosh, that is a lot. While a number of men holding 2 or more jobs rose to a merely 21%. From 3.4 million to 4.1 million. More and more women's earnings argument family incomes is stall the onset of impoverishment or to enjoy a middle-class lifestyle. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 1.5 million workers receive no more than a federal minimum wage, which was $3.80 per hour in 1990, less than California's minimum wage of $4.25 per hour. In the absence of meaningful assistance reform, women earn more than minimum wage are stripped of food stamps, medical care for children because of their higher income status. Given the racist wage differentials paid women and men of color, the earnings of women of color are essential to family survival, even in homes where men are working. Employment segregation and differences in wage and education reflect the disparities of salaries among college graduates with 1 to 5 years of employment. Black women earn $11.41 per hour, and black men earn $11.26 per hour. White women earn $11.38 per hour, and white men earn $12.85 per hour, according to an October 1994 New York Times report. The same article concedes that wages for black people with only a high school education eroded during the 1980s. According to Karl Marx in 1990s, 1.8% of employed African American women completed 4 years of college, 7.7% of African American men, 11% of European American women, and 22% of European African men. In 1987, although working more hours and more full-time jobs outside the home than European American women, African American women earned $1,664 less. Asian women, in contrast, earned $1,000 more per year than European American women. Higher education level and residency in high-paying states for Asian women. For example, in California, rather than southern states where wages were often depressed, contributed to these economic disparities. Women of color are rarely paid a wage comparable to that of the white European women. Nearly all women are denied equal play with white European men. And overwhelmingly, immigrant women of color are relegated to dangerous and unprotected types of work in the underground or illegal economy. In the United States, labor conditions for African, Caribbean, Asians, and Latin illegal immigrant females mirror those of, mancuandarios or fields in the developing world. In Florida, Haitian women, along with Haitian and Jamaican men, subsist in Baptiste immigrant farm camps with conditions similar to those of slave labor camps. The garment industry, sweatshops in Los Angeles, New York, and Boston. Got to do my little thing here. Oh my gosh. Hate when I miss it the first time. There you go. Got it. Boston. in Boston recreated the same severe economic exploitation of health hazards, where 90% of the sweatshop workers are immigrant women and children. Subsistence wages in such workplaces in Los Angeles are reported as low as $50 for a 60-hour week. Without green cards, women who are threatened with deportation cannot obtain adequate medical services, legal representation, or state protection when they are denied or cheated on their wages, assault, or raped. These slavery-like conditions are exacerbated by U.S. prisons. Their prison industry and workfare programs also represent an undocumented and unorganized labor force disproportionately made up by people of color. There, the state owns you, convict labor, like the postbellum sharecropping and supplanted legal enslavement of Africans brought to America, place workers outside all law. Even the United Nations does not recognize the right of incarcerated people to labor without exploitation, according to Nia Lesson. The most life-threatening work in the state's household is in the underground economy, namely sexual work. The myth that men and women from non-dominant ethnic groups are sexually deviant, rapists, and whores, respectively, legitimizes sexual and racial violence. This myth also rationalizes the sexual exploitation of women and children in prostitution and other segments of the sex industry, facing sexual imperialism that is reminiscent of slavery. African American women often find that their bodies are simultaneously reduced to units of labor and sexual commodities. The African American experiences of dehumanizing sexuality or sexual slavery as work is shared by Japanese Americans and Japanese minorities in Japan. After Japanese women achieved the vote in 1954, the women's movement there moved from advocating suffrage to campaigning to end prostitution and sex tourism. In South Asia, the industry's sex tourists service businessmen from Japan, the United States, and Western Europe, Thailand, Filipina. It says it's Filipina, not the other one, I think. South Korean women and females and male children are sold, imported, and then exported and imported as commodities. Jesus Christ. The Fimintern has reported that the sex industry and sexual slavery as integral components of modern tourism increased Japan's gross national product, as well as benefited the country's military. According to Fimintern, prostitution serves as an income source for the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. In the 1970s, 2,000 Japanese men entered Korea daily, mainly for sex tour. When Koreans were forcibly transplanted to Japan as laborers during the war, Korean women were forced to service army men as prostitutes in camps. Half a century later, women still protest state imprisonment and sexual violence. In August 1994, women in South Korea threw eggs, chanting and demonstrating in front of Japanese embassies in Seoul, demanding direct compensation to Philippine, Chinese, and Korean survivors and their families. The women condemned the Japanese government proposal to spend $1 billion over 10 years to finance culture and student exchange as allotment for the incarcerating 200,000 women to serve as prostitutes for Japanese soldiers during World War II. After its defeat, the government of Japan coerced geisha geishas into serving as comfort girls to American occupation forces, quote, to protect the purity of respectable Japanese women, end quote, using its police officers to organize women as prostitutes. Any geisha who attempted to run or hide was arrested and surrendered to U.S. troops. Asian feminists note, quote, both Korean it's Kisaeng, and the Japanese geishas have been offered by their own governments as sacrificial lambs to men of invading foreign powers. The outrage is committed against Kisaeng, the Kisaeng, do not occur in a vacuum. They are profoundly related to the contempt shown by Japanese men for the women of their own country. Contempt is exacerbated when states portray women as, quote, ethnic aliens, end quote, to increase the benefits of their exploitation. Finneturn authors write that whereas in the late 1960s, South Korea sold young men as mercenaries, troops, to the U.S. government for $1 billion to fight in Vietnam. Now, South Korea sells young women. In 1973, 700,000 tourists brought in $300 million, quote, with the profits reaped by paying minuscule wages to workers, foreign businessmen by the bodies of South Korean women, end quote. 20 years later, the industry of sexual exploitation thrived. Jacqueline Hunt, president of the human rights organization Equality, now contends that the $1 billion offered by the Japanese government as compensation for Asian women forced to work in brothels during World War II is more symbolic than real, given the trafficking and ongoing violence against women that continues in Japanese sexual industry. Hunt recounts one recent atrocity. In April 1991, Maurice Cezanne, at 22-year-old dancer from the Philippines, now that's really Philippines, arrived in Japan to work at the Faces Club in Fukushima. 5 months later, she was admitted to the hospital on September 14th, 1991. She died. Her Japanese death certificate listed hepatitis as the cause for death. But when Miss Cezanne's family opened her coffin back in the Philippines, they saw that she had been badly beaten and stabbed. Go figure. A later autopsy by the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation indicated murdered, yet Japanese policies refused to release full medical and police records. Hearing in the Philippines determined the 33 Filipina entertainment worker, 12 under suspicion circumstances, died in 1991, according to Hunt. That year, the Philippine Labor Ministry estimate that nearly 80,000 Filipinas worked in Japan as entertainers, quote unquote, unable to leave or move freely because of confiscated passports and salaries withheld until completion of their contracts. The Yakuza, I think it's Yakuza. Sorry, I've been doing that. The Yakuza, I think. Japanese organized crime is considered to be heavily involved in this labor trade. Conclusion. It's not time yet, Rufus. The issues of sexual violence, forced and unpaid domesticity, productive rights, state discriminations, and social inequalities are ties that binds all women together. When these ties are cut by racial and ethnic division, forming coalitions is problematic. Perhaps one of the more telling tests will be to see what partnership African and Asian American women will form around U.S. foreign policy. The most critical connection will take place at home. However, given the surgency and of theories that purportedly explain the scientific basis of racial superiority, financed by the Pioneer Fund, which has historically and contemporary ties to neo-Nazism, the literature on race and intelligence by white male scholars, popularized in 1994 and 1995, constructs Asians and Ashkenazic Jewish people as intellectually but not politically superior to white people, or WASPs, which is like just I keep forgetting what it is. Western, what's the word? Anglo-Saxon. I forgot the PS means. Is the postmodern Darwin discourse of racial and economic supremacy posited by biological hierarchies that is supposedly revealed by genetics and intelligence quotas to reflect the political order, with black people on the bottom and whites battling Asians for the top. In the society whose dominant racialized myth constructs people of color ethnic groups as inferior to white Europeans and European Americans, and hence as a menace to society, civilization, and evolution. In its latest twist, this racist mythology offers seminal construction that permit certain ethnic peoples to escape from a debased status. Alleged Asian and Jewish superiority still is perceived as a threat to white civilization and white jobs. Interestingly, the escape clause couples the racial mandate to rule with sexual mandate to breed. The academic progeny of Thomas Malthus at City College, Harvard University, and California at Berkeley, Stanford, and other sites proclaim women as breeders and thus strategic players in the race war. White males promoting these theories argue that because their more fertile inferiors are outbreeding them, white and Asian women, the intellectual superior females, oh my gosh, must wake up and catch up. White men, mostly as conservatives and rightist politicians, in turn contribute to the responsible breeding by condemning abortion and reproductive rights while advocating sterilization or limited societal benefits to non-white immigrants and poor women, especially those who have children while on public assistance. Giving this climate of organized women for racially repressive mandates, coalitions, particularly among the marginalized, are essential for progressive movements. Despite compartmentalization, cultural ignorance, and inter-ethnic conflict of violence, individuals do cross borders, whereby transgressing color and caste lines without reproducing abuse or oppression. Discomfort and fiction are inevitable in such movements as activists and educators encounter a counter-racial divisionness, urging coalitions to resist violence despite distrust among members means emphasizing commonalities and crossing borders into unfamiliar territories. In quote, coalition politics turning the century, end quote. Bernice Johnson Reagan contends that coalitions are marked by low-level comfort. And here's the quote. Coalition work is not work done in your home. Coalition work has to be done in the streets. And it is some of the most dangerous work you can do. And you shouldn't look for comfort. Some people will come to coalition and they rate the success of the coalition in whether or not they feel good when they get there. They're not looking for a coalition. They're looking for a home They're looking for a bottle with some milk in it and a nibble, which does not happen in a coalition. You don't get a lot of food in a coalition. You don't get fed a lot in a coalition. In a coalition, you have to give, and it is different from your home. Highlights similarities in women's relationships to government policies and in societies that are affluenced by racial and sexual myths may not supply the warmth and familiarity that many desire. In a racially fragmented society, however, inter-ethnic coalition building that includes African Asian alliances could transform state households into spaces where more might feel at home. All right, and I got a little bit of time. We got 20 minutes. Let's see here. Let me look ahead. Let me look ahead real quick, everybody. Actually, let me do this couple things and then I'll look ahead. So the next thing is section 3, culture, politics, black women and sexual violence. That's the next part, the next section. And this chapter is chapter 6, Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, and gender abstraction. Let me see how far we got going. See, we're on page 138. So 138, let's keep going. 138. Hopefully the next one is better. 138. Come on. Show me a stopping point. Oh my gosh. All right, 138. 38, 39, 44. 42. So I got 7 more pages. Okay. So 138. Let's try to read 7 more pages. I might go over because all right, so let's go. We might go a little bit over. Okay, Anita Hill. Okay, we already read that part. All right, let's find out. The spotlight on the 1991 Supreme Court confirmation hearing for Clarence Thomas and the gender consciousness raised in the media coverage have made Thomas and Anita Hill name symbols for reverence and respect and ridicule of feminist and masculinist writings. In the wake of his anti-civil rights votes for the court and his September 11, 1995 public claim that the affirmative action is a Christian sin against whites, Thomas is more uniformly lampooned in the black press. Some of the reverence and ridicule surrounding both Thomas and Hill appears to be disconnected from reality and based more on gender abstraction. That is, on the notion of sexual politics, conveniently and romantically served from class and radical politics. The respect given to Anita Hill, however, reflects the fact that she withstood the racist and sexist harassment of ultra-conservative Senate Judiciary Committee members during the nationally televised hearing. Although their diatribes carried a virulent authoritative contempt that only the fusion of racial, economic, and sexual elitism could manage to spew, Anita Hill maintained her personal dignity, which certainly deserves respect and praise. Still, both respect and praise in this case are weighed with irony, for Hill also worked to implement the policies of white privilege and patriarchy by eroding civil rights programs redressing past and present discrimination. Her harassness did her career to an ultra-conservative of the Reagan-Bush administration and still employed her its former employer Clarence Thomas to recreate Hill as a martyr heroine for mobilizing women and feminists is only possible if one disconnects her from the singing the singing radical, racial, and class politics she embraced and likely still embraces. And or B, one maintains that racism and classism are abstractions too, that is irrelevant in sexual politics. In other words, to make her a symbol or an icon, one must create a martyr heroine as a gender abstraction. Throughout 1992, articles were written about Anita Hill as a feminist role model, a quote race traitor, end quote, and a quote unquote Republican traitor. These were part of the spillovers of the hearing, as would be a number of books, including 2 anthologies reflecting the debates on the hearings among African Americans, Court of Appeal and Race, Gender, and engendering justice, allegations of sexual harassment by Hill, a woman from Thomas's caste, were able to delay the Supreme Court confirmation of Thomas when his own political record, anti-black, anti-female, anti-poor, anti-working class, anti-youth, anti-elderly, could not. The New York City-based Center for Constitutional Rights released a statement that Clarence Thomas has unsustainable for the U.S. Supreme Court because his lack of experience, an unqualified candidate, was being promoted by anti-affirmative action politicians, as well as anti-democratic bias. The center reported that under Thomas' dictatorship as chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, class action suit declined dramatically compared to individual cases in 1988. 40 to 87% of cases were closed because they were improperly investigated by field officers and state fair employment practices agencies. Case backlog rose from 31,500 in 1983 to 46,000 in 1989. Possessing time increased from 4 to 7 months in 1983 to nearly 10 months in 1989. Equal pay cease cases declined for 35 in 1982 and 7 in 1989. Concerning affirmative action, the center noted that Thomas changed the EEOC policy to establishing goals and timetables for businesses to open jobs to white women and men of color, reinstating the policy only after the Supreme Court in 1986 decisions to uphold these guidelines. At the same time, the court upheld affirmative action, which ironically enabled Thomas to further his own educational and legal career as Reagan's EEOC appointee and Bush's nominee to replace pioneer civil rights litigator Thurgood Marshall. Clarence Thomas sparred his way through the hearing amid allegations of sexual harassment by portraying himself as a victim of high-tech lynching. Historically, post-bellum lynching victims were black, and they haven't, this is in white, who resisted rather than collaborate with racist practice. Thomas' black victim performance opportunistically appropriated lynching as a defensive strategy, and metaphor, and as such was ideologically compatible with the anti-civil rights backlash of recent Republican presidencies. Claims of innocence can be based either on symbolism or specificity. For Clarence Thomas, a man who faithfully executed the policy wishes of his conservative white employers to assert during the hearing that he, quote, wasn't harmed by the Klan or the Aryan Nation, but by this process, end quote. The high-tech lynching of an uppity black man distorted the historical significance of racist killings as punishment on non-compliance with conservatives, reactionary whites. What, whatever, whatever one assumes about the charges Thomas was able to co-opt anti-racist and anti-lynching discourses because public critiques of racialized sexuality and fears were widely discouraged, because Hill did not address the issues of race or how her sexuality had been racialized. This performance of a black male was racially sexualized, captured center stage. Surviving and refusing to be silent about sexual victimization are courageous acts, yet survival or speaking out does not make one a public hero, the heroine. Public responsibilities and commitments must be taken into account in the making of women heroes. I can't say the word. In gender, politics, feminists or counter-feminist, race or class ideologies still count. For example, if a female staffer in David Duke's Louisiana gerbil notarial campaign had courageously come forward with accounts of sexual harassment by Duke, who incidentally backed Clarence Thomas, although I would have supported her right to confront her abuser, I would not have named David Duke the only villain, given that they both share reactionary ideologies. Obviously, the abuse of right-wing women building careers under the tutelage of right-wing men who may implement racist, classist, sexist, and heterosexist policies need to stop. Eulogizing such women is extremely problematic, given their anti-democratic and retrogressive racial politics. Supporting Hill's right to a fair hearing on sexual harassment requires compassion and outrage over sexual abuse. But place her on the pedestal reveals how wild analyses of sexual and racial abuse and democratic politics had become. That at that time, Anita Hill had implemented Reaganite anti-civil rights policies taught at Oral Roberts University Law School, and maintained that Robert Bork was unjustly denied a seat in the Supreme Court. To Hill, therefore, one had to imitate Clarence Thomas, Orrin Hatch, John Dafford, Arlene Strom Thurmond, George Bush, and company in their wolfish cries of, quote, lynching. This time with the added cry of harassment, quote unquote. Following the opportunistic moves on political language, history, and reality throughout the hearing, one could first make trivial and then manipulate the lengthy red record of racial and sexual violence and imagery that African American struggles to survive, or one could have chosen to mimic contortionist. I don't know this word. I think it's contortionists claims in an episode of Tony Brown's Journal with Thomas supporters Phyllis Berry Myers and John Doggett that Thomas was lynched while Anita Hill was raped, claims that thereby attained some false enclosed and unifying blackness. Rape and lynching are tied together in the history of African American women who were tortured and raped prior to and during lynchings. Black women were also lynched, also with African American men who assisted them for resisting or avenging rape by white men. Because manipulating histories is a useful tool for denying reality in its it is unsurprising that the political history and reality of African American men's sexual abuse in African and African American women is equally manipulated and denied. The Hill-Thomas hearing provided equal opportunity to create pedestals laden with right-wing role models, black and white males and females, and Anita Hill, who had overcome her personal victimization with dignity and restraint, painfully lacking in Thomas and most of his multiracial female and male cheerleaders, was the most appealing. Consequently, in November 12, 1991 issue of the New York-based weekly The Village Voice, African-American columnist Lisa Jones, after describing the, quote, Bush-Thomas lynching strategy, end quote, and the racist and sexist vilification of African American women, wrote that, quote, Anita Hill shunned victimhood as a role model, end quote. And yet Hill shunned or embracing victimhood could not possibly be a role model if being one means having a responsible relationship to African American communities and progressive democratic politics. For Jones, the class of racial politics of Hill are as irrelevant as Thomas' sexual politics are for the editor-based weekly City Sun, who superficially treated the charges of sexual harassment while focusing on the detrimental political relationships of both Thomas and Hill to African American communities. Quote, the truth is that Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill are cut from the same cloth. Black people's interests were not the motivating factor for either Thomas or Hill's career move. Such articles based on gender abstraction fail to present the discussion of sexual political connected to racial and class politics, or the ways in which Black identification shaped responses to sexual abuse. In the aftermath of the hearing and televised spectacle that became popular entertainment, much as the O.J. Simpson trial would in 1995, the veracity of Hill's courageous testimony has been disparaged by some and substantiated by others. That neither Hill nor Thomas worked for the benefit of African American probably led to more jocular attitude among the number of Black male intellectuals in their commentary on the hearing. More sober attitudes among Black male intellectuals were later expressed over controversies involving Benjamin Chavez, C. Eric Lincoln, and Mike Tyson. Chavez, the former head of the NAACP, was accused of sexual harassment. Lincoln was convicted on charges of sexual assault of a Black female Harvard Divinity graduate student. Mike Tyson was found guilty of raping a Black beauty pageant contestant. Promoted white civil rights leaders, Black scholars, and sports heroes clearly invited different forms of consideration. Reductionism is endemic to discussions in which the politics of sexual harassment are isolated from racial and class politics. When the African American experience was reduced to African American male experience, opportunistically performed by Thomas, he also represented the transracial male because his accuser was Black, not white. The woman's experience becomes reduced to the whitened middle-class female experience uncritically worn by Hill. The irrational and illogical commentary on the hearing underscore how prevalent reductionism is. White women commentators on national public radio stated that Clarence Thomas needed a Black on the Senate Judiciary Committee, whereas Anita Hill needed a woman. Neither the fact that Hill is both Black and female, nor the fact that there is no monolithic Black or women's voice or vote spared listeners and an entity of coverage lost in gender abstraction. Much of the analysis obscured the political ties of gender to race and class and revealed the racial and class politics of women and men mobilizing under the banner of sexual politics. The issue of class mystification routinely appears in writings about this case. On October 1991, Boston Globe wrote, in confirming Thomas in the face of Hill's odious, highly detailed, a credible story, the Senate clear message will be that women who complain of sexual harassment are not to be believed. If an understanding, articulate law teacher who knows the rules cannot get a group of men to hear her, can a secretary have much hope? This question suggests that Hill had no race, although credibility is tied to race and refers to class in an incomplete way. The secretary is likely to be believed if she is white and accused the black janitor. Women harassed by men of their race and class have little credibility before the law. Women with race and class privilege are more credible than the accused if he is someone with the lower status and social hierarchy, which is a significant part of the history of lynching, referring to Hill as if she had no race or class interests, gives her the guise of respectability, which in this society takes the form of middle-class white heterosexual womanhood. Isolating sexual harassment from the race and class analysis thus reduces decisions of such harassment to abstraction. The lack of the class and ideological analysis among some organizers and commentators in the Hill-Thomas hearing was critiqued by Bell Hooks. Quote, must we call all women, quote, sisters? An essay criticized by some feminists because of its rejection of a generalized gender solidarity, irrespective of politics. In the, quote, The Invisible Ones, the Emma May Martin story, and One Thomas Didn't Tell, end quote. Lisa Jones also offers a critique of class politics in The Choice of Hill as a symbol of feminism and women's victimization. According to Jones, that sexual harassment was a more appealing middle-class women issue than welfare rights is a reason why fewer women rallied around Thomas's sister Emma E. Martin. Thomas, in Lee Atwater fashion, publicly chastised her for welfare dependency. Quote, she gets upset when the mailman is late with her welfare check, noting how economics and class shape women's mobilization and resisting sexual violence and harassment. Jones observes Thomas' distortion of his sister's life says a lot about him, but it says even more about America. No childcare, no healthcare system, dead-end jobs, dysfunctional schools. Yes, but what of the political media value put on the lives of women like Martin, especially black women like Martin? The Martins of this country are pigeonholed as sub-American, sub-female, sub-human, end quote. The ad hoc group organized by African-American academic activists Barbara Ransby, Ellis Berkeley Brown, and Deborah King pitched an educational and fundraising campaign with a large age in the November 17th, 1991, Sunday New York Times, under the title, quote, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, end quote. This analysis demystifies abstraction by speaking out against the partnership between the destructive U.S. policies and the cynical posturing of Bush, Hatch, Specter, Danforth, and their employees, excerpted below the signed by more than 1,600 women of African descent. It broke the routine rally around media heroes and heroines and the diversion of gender abstraction. And here's a quote. As women of African descent, we are deeply troubled by the recent nomination, confirmation, and seating of Clarence Thomas as an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. We know that the presence of Clarence Thomas on the court will be continually used to divert attention away from historical struggles for social justice through suggestions that the presence of a black man on the Supreme Court constitutes the assurance of that rights of African Americans will be protected. Clarence Thomas' public record is ample evidence that this will not be true. Further, the consolidation of conservative majority on the Supreme Court seriously endangers the rights of all women, poor, and working class people, and the elderly. The seating of Clarence Thomas is an affront not only to African American women and men, but to all people concerned with social justice. We are particularly outraged by the racist and sexist treatment of Professor Anita Hill, an African American woman who was maligned and cascaded for daring to speak publicly for her experience of sexual abuse. The malicious defamation of Professor Hill insulted all women of African descent and sent a dangerous message to any woman who might contemplate a sexual harassment complaint. As women of African descent, we express our vehement opposition to the policies represented by the placement of Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. The Bush administration, having obstructed the passage of civil rights legislation, impeded the extension of unemployment compensation, cut student aid, and dismantled social welfare programs, has continually demonstrated that it is not operating on the best interest, nor is the appointee. We pledge ourselves to continue to speak out in defense of one another, in defense of African American communities, and against those who are hostile to social justice, no matter what color they are. No one will speak for us but ourselves. This text is unique in that it addresses structural politics and racism, as well as sexual abuse, with some form of integrated analysis that was missing from camps that polarized both issues or from groups that treated the accusation and hearing as pure spectacle. Let me make sure. Let's see how far that. Okay, I'm gonna read. This is the last part. Two more paragraphs, and we're done. Conclusion: the selective use of black women as feminist icons reflects their abstraction roles in American culture and the ways in which political ideology influences on iconography. The extensive of multiracial rally around Anita Hill was not repeated in 1993 when President Clinton withdrew his support for Lani Guerra, his nominee for Justice Department Civil Rights Division, in the wake of the conservative backlash against her strong stance on voting rights for minorities. Nor did the massive protests like those surrounding Hill appeared in 1995 when Clinton fired Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders for her candid stance on the need for sex education in American schools. Gender abstractions that reconstruct Hill and Thomas as icons veiled the anti-democratic politics upheld by both black Republicans. The construction of Thomas as a racial icon, simultaneously representing black victimization and resistance, mirrored the construction of Hill as a gender icon, representing female victimization and resistance. The disingenuousness of anti-black and anti-civil rights politics among African Americans was highlighted in President Bush's selection of Thomas as a successor or a civil rights leader who successfully argued Brown versus the Board of Education and desegregating American schools. Thomas' retrograde gender politics were unconsequential to his selection by pro-choice president. His reactionary sexual politics could hinder but not obstruct the confirmation fueled by racial politics that were palatable to the far right who supported him. If allegations of sexual violence could have derailed such a strong political commitments to reactionary racial politics, they would not have been accusations made by a black woman who in America mind embodies the racial sexual other. And that's it. And then we'll start tomorrow on symbolic rage. Prosecutorial performance of racialized representation of sexual violence. So we'll stop here. We're stopping on page 146. Yay. Damn. I didn't realize all that. Like, I was born in those times, like 9 years old. So, like, I don't remember any of these things. So, yeah. I bet my parents were for this. We're like, yeah, Reagan, the best. I bet my parents were. I bet they were. I bet they were. Looking back at what my dad's behavior, my mom's behavior, definitely were. All right, 146 is at the end. Doing good. Hello. I don't know if I have any coins. Let's find out. No coins. I don't have coins. I'm sorry. No coins. All right. I didn't realize how much that was big. I did like the Japanese and stuff like that, and how the United States and has their brother is Japan and stuff like that, but they still stifle Japan. You know what I mean? You can't get above us, you know. And then utilizing women and stuff to fetishize the needs of men, and then the sexual. God, dude, it's wild stuff. All right. Well, I did go over 12 minutes, and I have to feed Rufus. All right. And there's barely anybody here anyway. So I hope everybody enjoyed the reading. And I will talk to you all later. All right. Have a good night.